summative assessment systems and processes, that it might be quite useful to step back from that from time to time and look at the more formative aspects, of which arguably we as teachers can be much more in control. So, and then folios I have interpreted as meaning portfolios. And that leads me on to my first question to you all. Who or how many of you are using portfolios or e-portfolios? One person? Two? Folios? Yeah? Portfolio. Yeah? Yeah? And e-portfolios? Any of you using e-portfolios? Okay, so we'll explore that a little bit. Now, in the brief that I've been given, I was asked to attend to the following. This discussion group will explore a variety of categories and functions of educational assessment. The group will also explore concepts of portfolios and e-portfolios and their possible roles and functions in particular kinds of assessment. By the end of the session, the group will have identified some advantages and disadvantages of the use of portfolios in assessment, as well as barriers to implementing it. So maybe we want to bear this in mind, like all learners should do, where they want to get to by the end of the session, and maybe we want to come back to this slide at the end of the session and see whether or not we've actually achieved our aims and our goals. I would like to stress that in order for this to work and to be successful, I can talk at you for hours, don't worry about that, yeah? But that wouldn't really fit into this whole notion of discussion group, yeah? So I'm looking for active participation from you, and what I'm going to try and do is just throw out a few ideas and stimuli, and then invite you for comments, for discussion. And if after a while you think he hasn't mentioned this yet, then just, you know, put up your hand, and then I might say, well, bear with me for a minute, I'm getting there. Or say, yeah, okay, let's talk about that now. So I thought it is sort of in keeping with the theme of the conference and all of that. It might be quite interesting to start off by thinking about assessment in relation to this whole notion of taking ownership of learning. Now, one of the things you'll often find is that assessment is seen as something extra that comes at the end, that's bolted on, and that's clearly not how it should be. Yeah? And I think it's important to start to realize that assessment is, or at least should be, in order for it to be really valuable, an integral part of learning and teaching. So as soon as I start to sit down and think about my curriculum, as soon as I sit down and start about my individual lessons, the learning objectives, I need to start to think about what mechanisms do I actually have in place in order to make any sort of judgment about whether or not my learners have actually achieved what I'm trying to do with them. And I work a lot with student teachers back at my university, and when they start out in their teaching, what do you think they tend to do? They write lovely lesson plans, and in those lesson plans it's all about them as teachers and what they will do and say in the lesson, and then they go and tick that off and they think, great, yeah, I've had a good lesson because I went through everything I thought and I've done everything I thought. But it takes a while for people to think, and what about the learner? You know, what have they actually done? Yeah? What am I expecting them to do? And it's just at that sort of level, that's where I think, you know, assessment is starting to come in, to make it very clear that within your individual lesson plan, you've got ways of having some ideas about what you expect from your learners. And, yep, I've got it here, so right next door, yeah, yeah. So that's at that sort of level. But in the broader sort of picture, I'm drawing here on a graphic from the Teaching and Learning in 2020 review group. So it might be interesting for you to see that not only you here in Pakistan are being asked to envision what things are going to be like in 15 years, in 20 years, and so forth. That's happening all over the world. And this is one of the things that the UK government is very keen on. It's very keen on, and you know, you can start where you want. What I wouldn't necessarily do is start here. Maybe let's start here therefore. Yeah? Learning how to learn, developing the skills and attitudes to becoming better learners. This particular group sees as one important element in the whole process of teaching and learning, and therefore in assessment. So the argument would be that in order to be effective, you don't just need to make sure that you know your content, you transmit your content to your learners, and you test them on that content, but that you also, within your curriculum, prepare learners with the right range of strategies they will need in order to learn effectively. And that can be, you know, very, very simple. I don't know how many of you are language teachers in the room, but one of the things language teaching, what's very important in language teaching is to learn vocabulary. And for some reason, learners tend to be quite happy to write down vocabulary from A to Z with one word in one language here, in the other language there, then use a piece of paper, cover it up, and start to learn. And this is just about the most ineffective way of learning vocabulary. But for some reason, the kids do it. So, you know, it's starting at that sort of level, techniques of how you might go about being effective. And that then also links into giving pupils a voice, and we've talked about that as a theme of the conference, and I think that's very important too. Establishing the habit of talking about learning and teaching and how to improve it. We had yesterday in a session that I was in, the question came up about standards and how important are standards and are clear learning outcomes and criteria for assessment. And whilst all those of you who are part of a national system will know that there can be a huge backwash effect of an externally set examination on you, the teacher, as to how you're going to get your learners to that particular point, and that's not so good. But what those sorts of things, those sorts of expectations do, they give you a language which you can then start to explore with your learners. And in terms of assessment, one of the things that's worked quite well in the context that I've worked in is making sure that the learners understand how what you are asking them to do relates to this bigger goal that they're trying to achieve. So how does one activity fit into the lesson that you're planning, and how does that lesson then fit into the goal? So one of the questions the learners have is, why am I doing that? You know, it's boring. Yeah? At least they understand that in order to get there, they need to do these sorts of things. So that might be one way of interpreting this notion of pupil voice in relation to assessment, getting them to understand what it's about. And then, of course, assessment for learning. Is that a term that's widely used in Pakistan? There is this distinction between assessment of learning, and assessment for learning. So assessment for learning would be the formative dimension, assessment of learning more the summative dimension. And this is about coming to a shared understanding of learning goals and how to achieve them. So again, a big way of involving your learners. And then formative assessment. What can we say about formative assessment? Well, if you have a look through the literature, and I've had occasion to do that recently in the course of a project that I was leading, I came across a number of things that I'd like to share with you briefly that I think are quite important. research has clearly shown that assessment for learning is premised on the notion that learners will improve most if they understand the aims and processes of their learning. So exactly the thing that diagram was trying to show you earlier on, there is evidence there to suggest that. That means possess a certain amount of reflexivity at a meta level, know where they are positioned in relation to the intended learning outcomes and how they can achieve them or close the gap in their knowledge, skills and understanding. So it's very, very important for learners to know what they're aiming for, where they're at, in order to be able to get a sense of and some help with what they have to do in order to bridge that gap. Yeah, please.
I don't understand the word meta level.
Meta level, you can talk about, yes, let's use the language metaphor again, yeah? I'm using language now, and I can also try and analyze language, and in order to analyze language I need to use meta language, so I need to use words like nouns or verbs, or and that becomes then meta language that allows me to talk about the phenomenon of language. And that's the same here at a meta level, yeah? So you have a level of concepts at a conceptual theoretical level that allow you to explore the processes that learning comprises. Yep. And one of the things that research clearly shows is that learners engaging in a process of stepping back from what they're doing and looking at it from a little bit of a distance at a level of reflexivity at the meta level can help them quite a bit in closing the gap between what they know now and what they should know. Assessment for learning centers on activities by teachers, tutors and or learner students that provide information that yield feedback suitable to make necessary modifications to teaching and learning. The important word here being feedback. And for you as a teacher and for me as a teacher, it's very important to get feedback as often as possible. So as I'm standing here and talking to you, I'm getting feedback from you. I'm listening to what you might say, and it's very helpful if you actually, say, sorry, I don't understand this. That's good feedback, yeah? Other than that, I can see you're smiling at me. Great, I think you're sort of with me. Yeah, you understand what I'm talking about. You're sort of looking at the ceiling and all of that. You're not so interested, so I need to do something about that. Yeah, so that's all feedback. Yeah, but I have to either be sort of a pretty good teacher or make some pretty educated guesses what the reasons might be for you looking at the ceiling or you smiling. It's much better to